So I've really enjoyed the last couple of videos I've put out. I've enjoyed making them. They've been a lot of work, but I've learned a lot about all the different amps that I've used and also how to maybe conduct some of these things going by some of the comments. Now, I don't perhaps do it exactly the way that every single person would like, but I've really enjoyed the interaction and finding out what people find important. Having said that, I'm going in a completely silly direction for this one. And if you like it, maybe this is how I'll be doing them going forward. Now, as a kid, my favourite game, absolute favourite game, was Top Trumps. This was a card game where, let's say you had the car version of it, it would sort of score the cars for various things, whether that was, I don't know, looks, price, engine size. 0 to 60 was my favourite, high speed, top speed. So you could have an Aston Martin and your mate could have a Porsche, and you'd see which would win. And whoever won that round took the card off the other one, so that they built a pack of cards up. I loved this game so much. I had so many different sets. I saved up all my pocket money, washed the windows at our house when I could to earn a little bit of money here and there. And well, I've sort of missed them, to be honest. And if you think about it, my channel has basically been a bit like that. You know, what is this one like versus this one? So I've spared no expense in the graphics for today's video. And we're starting with one amp versus another. Now, this video was gonna start off as similar to the last one, 11 amps with one guitar. I'm still doing that, except I'm breaking it up into these pairs. Now, the first pair I've already decided for myself. The winner of those two will go forward, and then I'm going to use a random number generator to pick the next amp that it sort of plays against. And then I'm gonna score based on 5 categories. So, those 5 categories are features. You know, what sort of things can you do on the amp that helps you as a player? Next will be playability. You know, how does the amp feel to play? That's quite an important thing for me. You know, like touch sensitivity and sustain and dynamics. Then the price. I'm gonna tell you the price of the amp and I'm gonna rate that price based on what you get, maybe even against what your resale value could be. And then the completely subjective cool factor. How cool is this amp really? Would I really want to like turn up to a gig or a jamming session with mates, you know, with a 2-rock and 2x12? Maybe that's a bit try hard. I don't know. We'll find out when we do that top trump there. But I'm going to do that for each of the amps and you might disagree with me on some of them. And then lastly, and most importantly, tone. What does it sound like, right? I'm going to be playing the same guitar. This video is the Les Paul Custom, which I'll show you more about in a minute. Now, the tone to me is the most important part, the sound of this amp. You know, I could actually pick an amp based on sound, even if everything else was a little bit iffy. It's likely that playability will play into that because it probably helps you make a better sound. But for this purpose, I'm giving the sound or tone double points. So the first 4 things have 5 points each, and the last one has 10. So, right, we're kicking this off with the Marshall JTM45 that I've got. It's a vintage one from 1965. And we're playing that against the Tone King Royalist Mark III. Now, I thought this was one to kick it off that I wanted to do because they both do a very similar thing. Let me show you closer.
1, 2, 3.
So I'm going to be using, where I need to, the Fryette PS100. The Tone King Royalist, for example, has an inbuilt attenuator, which we'll talk about when we come to features. But that meant I could keep the clips to a volume that I'm happy with, under 100 decibels. That's going to be like my mark for this. But with the amps that don't have a master volume, I'm going to use the attenuator to get the best sound out of it. The fact that it doesn't have a master volume, I probably talk about in another part of its scoring, right? Makes sense, features and so on. I think that means we'll get the best sound out of them. And if you are really, really dedicated to your tone, you'll be carrying that Fryette or other attenuator around with you anyway. No pedals today. Let's have a quick look at the guitar before we then get the close-up of the amps. Okay, so this is the 1957 Murphy Lab Les Paul Custom that I bought recently at Peach. I've not used it as much on the channel as I'd like to, so I thought it would make a good one to do this whole set of videos with. It's a nearly £11 guitar, which, you know, these customs are heavier than normal. They've got an extra pickup, and this one's got the Bigsby. And overall, the whole feel of the guitar is really substantial. But that does not mean this is not a stonkingly great guitar. I absolutely love this thing. Massively resonant, it's full of body, it's really soulful. I love the way it sounds in all the pickup positions. It's out of phase in the middle, out of phase between the middle pickup and the bridge, that is. And overall, you can do so much with this guitar. I love the look of it. I love the way it's been made. And so it's a bit of a dream guitar, to be honest with you. It works really well for this type of playing. You know, I mean, you can play pretty much anything you want on a Les Paul, but I particularly like with this sort of guitar to play this sort of slow BB King style blues. I think you can really get involved in changing, you know, pickup selection and volume knobs and tone knobs. And although you won't always see it on the screen because I've chopped the clips up, I do change things here and there as I go along. So there's so much you can do, and it's really flexible. But yeah, this to me is just a beautiful guitar that I really, really enjoy playing. Okay, let's start with features, all right? Let's go with the Tone King first. Now, this amp is pretty jam-packed. It's only really missing a couple of major things, which I'll get into in a second, but it has 2 channels. Now, although the channels aren't different, there are 3 voices duplicated on each channel, and the voices are called 1964, 1967, and 1970. That's JTM45, which we played today to compare to the other amp, a plexi, and a super lead. So you can get 3 quite different gain structures and gain levels out of them, okay? Each channel then has a separate attenuator. Each of the main volume knobs has a pull-out fat switch, so you can add a bit of fatness to it. The attenuator has the ability to add top-end brightness or presence back in. And it's got a foot switch to change between the channels, which I actually used in the demo to have a cleaner channel and a more dirty channel, both still on the 1964 voice. So that's amazing. On the back, there's a line out, which is great. Really, it's absolutely packed with features, but it misses a big one for a lot of people, which is an effects loop. So an effects loop is Not something I ever thought was that important, to be honest with you, and not something I use much. But when you put reverb or delay, I find, in front of some of these amps that have a bit more gain and they don't have an effects loop, it can completely muck around with that and distort it and not make it sound as good as you want. So that is something I'm going to have to take into account. But before I give a score on that, let's talk about the JTM45. Now look, this is one of the amps that really started it all off, based on the Fender Bassman. So, you know, in 1965, I would say this was pretty amazing technology, really. Now, we don't have a master volume or an attenuator. I wouldn't have, you just don't get them in this amp. That's fine, but we still have to take that into account. Then you have your presence, you have a full EQ stack. Then you have two channels, so to speak, a bright channel and a normal channel. I'm using the bright channel here, but then I've got a little patch cable connecting the second input of the bright channel to the first input of the normal channel. So it makes an interactive volume. So there's a way that you can get more gain out of the amp at lower volumes, or you can beef up the bright tone with a bit more of that normal channel, right? You know how that works. So that is a pretty good feature, really. But I'm going to talk about this in this section. I'm basically at the sort of limit of EQ on this amp as I want it. It sounds a little bit dark, but I've got the presence and treble nearly all the way up. The bass is quite far down. The mids I've got quite dialed in as well. I'm using the bright channel, and yet it's still a little bit dark. Now, this was the bass version of the JTM45, which is really the one that you want, going by what I've been told by quite a few people. And so maybe that accounts for some of that darkness. But as it comes to features, it's quite a way down. I'm going to give the Royalist a 4 out of 5. It doesn't have an effects loop, and although it has a line out, it doesn't have built-in IRs, right? If it had those two things, it would definitely be a 5. That's basically as modern as you're getting these days. And that would make an amp a 5 for features. The JTM45, I'm giving a 2. It doesn't have a master volume, doesn't have an attenuator, doesn't have an effects loop, and its controls are pretty limited on that tone spectrum, really, compared to some of the more modern amps that we're now used to. So I think a 2 out of 5 is fair. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Okay, playability. What does it feel like to play a non-reverb Marshall type amp? If you've never played one of these amps before, these are pretty low gain, the JTM45 type amps, right? Yeah, higher gain than a clean Fender amp, but not really massive in sustain or in, you know, that sort of more modern thing that came later. So I'm gonna go straight to the score because it's hard to explain playability, but I'll explain it as best as I can. Without reverb, you feel like you've got less sort of cloud cover, so to speak, right? You feel a bit more naked, which when you're playing to a backing track isn't such a big deal. If you're just noodling around, you feel a little bit stiffer or less, you know, there's no reverb to sort of push into, okay? But on the other hand, I love the really natural sounding and feeling sustain with these amps. You hear it sometimes when I'm playing. It's not like a really compressed sustain, but when you hit a note and you want it to carry on for a bit, it will get quieter and quieter, it fades away, but it feels really natural. And you feel that in the playing of it, like there's a bit of pliability there, but not a huge amount of sustain or saturation. So sometimes you have to work at it. Now, although I like that, scoring this in terms of playability, I would have to drop a little bit for that. So not having a reverb affects playability, and having this lower gain, less sustain affects playability. It does. The first time you play one of these sort of Marshall type amps without the reverb and by, you know, maybe without a backing track, you do feel a little bit stiff, and it can be a bit stiff until you've got it cooking, which I have with the attenuator on both of them. But I'm going to give them a 3 out of 5 both for playability. You have to work a bit, which I really enjoy, and I prefer them with a Les Paul compared to a Strat because it's just pushing the front end harder. Makes it a bit easier to play. So yeah, 3 out of 5. price. It is an important part of determining like the outcome of choosing an amp, right? The price has to be. I've often probably been guilty of not mentioning prices and not taking into account comparing a small Fender combo to a large 2-rock and not comparing them on price. It is a bit silly of me, so that's why I've included it. Now the Tone King is around, let's say £2,600 just for the head. If I wanted to buy the cabinet on top, it's another £900 or so. So you're looking at £3,500 for the whole thing. The JTM45, on the other hand, being a vintage one and something that's quite desirable. This has not got an original output transform. It does have a correct Marshall one, but it's not the original. That makes it a little bit less expensive. But you're still looking at around £7,000 for the head. The cabinet is a beautifully made cabinet with that original cloth on it. I've forgotten the name of it right now. It's not easy to get that cloth. It's really expensive in itself if you have to buy it. And whoever made this, I've forgotten his name because I didn't have it made, but he had to be very careful to stretch it the right amount, but not to overstretch it and break it. It's also then got 2 vintage greenbacks in it. So this cabinet is over £2,000 in itself. So you're looking at £9,000 to £9,500 for a JTM45 setup like that with a 2x12. So that's quite a lot of money. But here's what I want to do with price. What is the resale value going to be? And therefore, that does affect the cost of an item. If you buy it for £5,000, but you can only sell it for 1,500 quid, it's going to get a 1 out of 5. The Royalist is a new amp. We don't have a lot to go on with that. I'm going to go with my gut feeling, which is that boutique amps that are pretty in demand and from the bigger boutique names like Tone King, you're going to probably lose a third in depreciation. Let's say you sell it a year from now. So you're £3,500, you're going to lose about 1,250 quid. I reckon you'll get 2,200, let's just say. So it is what it is, right? If you kept it for 5 years and you got 2,200 out of it, it hasn't actually cost you that much per year to play it. I don't think the price is that bad for the quality you're getting, the amount of features you're getting. We know Tone King's pretty reliable. We know that, well, I think they sound pretty great, but the feature set is amazing. So I'm going to give that a 3.5 out of 5. The JTM45. Now, vintage prices tend to go up and down in a market. You know, how much in demand are they? Are we sort of in a boom market or a bit of a bust? We're in a quiet market at the moment. If I wanted to sell this, probably not going to get quite the value that it would have got 18 months or 2 years ago when it was at the top. So if I wanted to sell this quickly right now, maybe I'd get 7.5 for the cabinet and the head together. So I would have lost 2 grand, let's say. Now I didn't actually pay for the amp like that. I was trading things and it came as part of a trade. But I'm going to say, considering that these actually could go up in price as well in future, I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5. It's a lot of money to put into something like this, but it's unlikely with such a, not prestigious, that's not the right word for such a thing, but like it's a very famous type of amp that will maintain interest over time, right? They don't make those anymore from 1965. It's a very early one. Missing the output transformer has knocked at least a couple of grand off the price, by the way. But considering you most likely could get your money out of it if you waited for a good market or just lose a little bit in the grand scheme of it, I think 3.5 is fair. Okay, coolness. Do we fall into categories, right? I fall into either you can be a Marshall guy or a Fender guy. Like one of the other amps we've got here is a vintage 1967 Super Reverb. I find black panel amps especially to be super cool. I love the look of them, love the way they look, just the design, as simple as that. I think they look very cool once the cloth on the front gets sort of aged and yellowed and browned and got little holes in it, and you know, that's pretty much a 5 out of 5 for coolness for me. You know, walking in with a Fender combo is just, for me, like, I love it. I've never been a Marshall guy, right? I think of Marshall as a bit more of the heavy rock side of things, maybe a bit more of the long hair, a bit more, you know, high gain and all of those things. So this is where we can have a bit of, you know, back and forth in the comments. I do think though that an old JTM45 with a 2x12 is pretty damn cool, and I'm giving the JTM a 4 out of 5. The Tone King, on the other hand, it's a very clean looking design. I think it's a very beautiful design. I don't know how cool it is, to be honest with you. If I walk in with that instead of the JTM, what am I going to feel? This is completely vacuous and ridiculous, by the way, I know that. But it's definitely not as cool as the JTM45. I'm going to go 2.5. I might feel a little bit like I'd rather keep that in the studio just because I'm an idiot and I think, like, is it a bit too try hard? I don't know. It's a bloody good amp. Is it cool? 2.5. Okay, let's get to the important part. We need to hear some more before we do that. So, when I was playing the Royalist, I had it set for 2 channels, a cleaner one and a dirtier one. I started off the piece cleaner and I hit the foot switch, and just by going into the other channel and having set that for more volume, I got more gain. That's brilliant, and I should have talked about that more in playability, but the 2 different sounds that I can get out, the fact that I can get 2 tones from the same amp at the foot, with a foot switch is brilliant to me. And that adds a lot to the overall sound capability of the amp, right? So I loved the lower gain sound of it. I thought it sounded so natural, so much like I expected a vintage amp to sound. And yet, if I wanted to hold on to a note, it was just about there. And it cut through the mix. But there's one issue I've got with this amp. The top end is not quite right. There's a little brashness and harshness. I've mentioned it in the few videos I've used this amp so far. I've always said I can't quite tame the top end. Doesn't matter if I roll back some treble, doesn't matter if I increase some bass or I use the fat switch. I don't use for example, I don't use the increased top end or presence boost on the attenuator, but yet there's something on the EQ that's just not, it's not sizzle, but it's brash at the top end. And that comes through, especially in the higher gain. To me, it sounds less natural, less warm, less impactful. The JTM45, on the other hand, I would say almost has the opposite problem. It doesn't have quite enough top end. As I mentioned, this is like, I think it was called the bass, super bass or bass JTM45. I'm not 100% sure. But it's reasonably dark. But what it does have is a throaty lower mid thing that is gorgeous. And I was worried it wouldn't come through in the mix. But with this sort of backing track that's not really busy, that's not got lots of other things going on, it came through really nicely in a sort of British blues way, which is what I'd want and expect out of it. And that throatiness really came through, and no top end sizzle, but like an upper mid or mid sweetness that I loved. Like, it's really nuanced, the sound. Now I'm going to just play a little clip of each amp without the backing track so you can hear a bit more closely. So while I don't think the Royalist sounded bad at all, nowhere near bad, I've struggled to dial in exactly the tone I want, which sounds a bit more like the JTM45. If I could add a bit more top end to the JTM, I would. As I said, I've almost maxed the presence and treble here. So it's hard to see on the knobs, but I can tell you there's not much left in there. That is a little bit of a thing. Like, I think in some situations, this could get lost in the mix. But for these videos, we've got to go with the backing track I've chosen. So when we do other backing tracks, it will play differently, maybe cut across differently. But I love that JTM45 for this. Now, being it's the first episode, I'm going to give the JTM for this, with the Les Paul Custom to a slow blues backing track, an 8.5 out of 10. There's not much more I need out of an amp than that, to be honest, in terms of sound. It will just come down to, for example, with a 2-Rock or a Fender, do I prefer the quality of that sound over this one? I don't know. The Royalist is going to lose a bit, just because when I hit it hard, there's a brashness that I really didn't like at all. And if I was recording this to put out, on a track, I'm not sure I would use it. I would use it for the cleaner bit at the beginning. Love it for that. I preferred it to, when I was dialing around with the amps, I tried the JTM45 like that. I actually preferred the Royalist for that. So that gives it quite a lot, but I'm going to give that. Okay, wait, first we should probably just top up the rest of the scores so we know what we're looking to get here. I don't actually know which of these would win, whilst I think I prefer the JTM45 slightly for sound. For everything else, really, it's a toss-up. Probably the Royalist is actually, out of every amp out on the market at the moment, one of my favourite. So yeah, let's see what the scores are doing right now. Okay, so I was going to give the Royalist a 7.5. Like, there's something about the JTM that has like such a round and warm tone, even at the top end, that it's just amazing. And I can't decide between giving the Royalist 7 and 7.5. Okay, so I wasn't actually expecting the JTM to win. I just thought the Royalist had too much sort of stuff going on for it. And obviously it is a third of the price roughly, but then it's, as I explained in the price, it's relative. You know, you'll sell the JTM for a lot more. Okay, so I mean, it was super close, and I just really interested to see when I do like a 2-rock, for example, what scores are going to relate to this. I'm trying to do this in as sort of spontaneous a way as possible, so I haven't sat down and written scores in advance or anything. I spend the time recording and then like filming the B-roll of what the amp does and has, and then that allows me to come up with that just off the top of my head, a score. It's a gut feeling. So like there's nothing engineered here. The whole way through it will just be sort of come up with a score based on my feeling of the amp that I've had. Most of these amps for, you know, played around with them a lot and had them a long time and know what everything does on the amp, so I know whether it's actually really useful or not. But it doesn't mean you're not going to see the Royalist again. It won't go back in the pool for the next sort of draw, which I'm going to do in a minute. So I'm going to draw the next amp and next 2 amps and the 2 after that, because I'm going to try and do 2 per video and I'm going to shorten each section. I just did this first one a bit longer on each section just because it's the first one. Some of the sections in future I'll barely explain them, right, if it's obvious, or just like really briefly. But I think this should be really good fun. And for me, it's just a silly fun way near Christmas time to do this. So I'm going to be playing the same guitar to the same backing track for these videos. I think I mentioned at the beginning this would be every day. I think actually it probably would be too much work for me to do that. So it's going to run up until, say, the end of the first week of New Year. So like the next 3 or 4 weeks that these videos will come out. And so it gives you a really good picture of what each of these amps does compared to the other. And then at some point I'll release a video compilation of just all the sound clips back to back. Like in those first 2 amp videos where near the end you got the big compilation. I will do that at some point once I've recorded them all. I haven't actually recorded all of the playing yet. Once I've done that, then I can release the compilation in a video on its own. But if loads of you think this video idea is absolute junk, let me know before I start putting loads of work into more of them, and I'll go back to doing the big 1 video thing. You know, for me, this is quite a lot of fun, but if it's just, you know, pointless or too silly, then do let me know. But yeah, hopefully you enjoy it as well. Okay, I've got a random number generator here on the screen. It's just for numbers 1 to 9. And the first one is number 1, which is the 2-rock classic reverb. Let's do it again. It's generating number 1 again. Let's keep going. Number 8, okay. Okay, so the Victoria Silver Sonic and the 2-rock classic reverb. Okay, that's the first pairing. Let's do the one after that, because I don't want either of these 2 amps in the next video, but I'll put it back in the drawer for the video after the next one. So, number 3, the 59 Bassman. Not the 1 again, not the 1 again. 7. Okay, the Trainwreck Liverpool Clone. Okay, this will be really interesting. Those are not pairs that I've put together at all, so that's part of the reason I'm doing this. It just helps me randomize the way that I'm comparing the amps, because ultimately a lot of people are not probably choosing between several different of the same style in their house. You know, you might be thinking, do I want a Vox type, or do I want a 2-rock type? Do I want a tweed type? Do I want a black panel type? So we're hearing them all back to back is what I'm doing. So, okay, I'll see you on the next one for the 2-rock classic reverb and the Victoria Silver Sonic, the 59 Bassman and the Trainwreck Clone. Cheers.